Newspaper columnist Mike Royko tells about a practical joke that was played on a man in Madison, Wisconsin. This man and 3 friends were enjoying a fishing trip at a secluded lake. They fished all day, they had a few beers, and played some poker. Every night they went to bed about 10 o'clock and got up before dawn for more fishing. One of them, who we'll call Joe, was the first to his bunk one night. He was exhausted and was snoring within a few minutes. Then one of his friends had an idea. He got Joe's wristwatch off the dresser and changed the time to 4:45. Then they all got together and changed their own watches, including the alarm clock, to 4:45. The alarm was set to go off at 5 o'clock, or just 15 minutes later. Then the conspirators turned off the lights, took off their clothes, and went to bed. 15 minutes later, when the alarm clock went off, they all got up, shuffled around, and made the grumbly, miserable sounds that people like me usually make early in the morning. One of them put toast and coffee on. The only miserable one, of course, was Joe. He sat on the edge of his bed, shaking his head and moaning. He kept looking at his watch and complaining that he felt like he had gotten no sleep at all. "I must be getting old," he said as they dropped anchor and began fishing. Every few minutes, he'd glance at his watch and look at the eastern horizon and say, "What time have you got?" 5:40, someone would say. "Boy, it's dark," Joe would say. And a little later, "What time have you got?" 6, someone would answer. Then Joe began to get concerned. Shouldn't it be getting light soon? By the time his watch said 6:40, he had stopped fishing. He just sat there staring into the darkness. Finally, his voice, crackling in genuine terror, said, "I'm telling you, something is wrong. It's not getting light today. It's not getting light." "It's the end of the world," his buddies hooted. "Doesn't matter," one of them said, "because the fish aren't biting anyway." That's when Joe caught on, and he took it rather well, although they did have to wrestle a swinging oar out of his hands. It's a fun little story, but Joe's words are haunting if you think about them for just a few moments. Something is wrong. It's not getting light. There are times in all of our lives when we'll feel that soul-crushing terror. Something is wrong. It's not getting light. St. John of the Cross referred to it as the dark night of the soul. Jairus knew about that kind of darkness. He had come to see Jesus. He pleaded with the Master, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she'll be healed and live." Now, is there a more helpless, more desperate feeling than having one of your own children become critically ill? Is there ever a time darker than that? Albert Miller is a Lutheran pastor in Houston, Texas. His son, Dale, had been killed in an automobile accident. One day, a colleague asked Albert about his family. Albert told him that they were fine, and he also told him that he had lost a son named Dale. "How old?" asked the colleague. 21, Albert replied. "How?" asked the colleague. "A careless truck driver," Albert replied. "When?" asked the colleague. 1992, Albert said softly. The colleague whispered but one more word that showed the depth of his understanding. The word was yesterday. More than 20 years before, but still yesterday. The death of a child is perhaps the most devastating event that can occur to a family. It can tear a family apart. One psychiatrist noted that, even though no adequate studies have been done, some authorities estimate that as many as 75% of couples may separate after the death of a child, especially if they do not seek competent help. Jairus was a man in pain. His little girl was dying. We know Jairus was desperate because he came to Jesus for help. You see, Jairus was a ruler of the synagogue, and his colleagues would not look favorably on the fact that Jairus had invited Jesus into his home to heal his little girl. They'd be shocked. He would be humiliated. What credentials did Jesus have? Where had he gone to school? But what authority did he heal? Jairus couldn't say. But none of that mattered at this point. The only thing that mattered was the health and well-being of his daughter. Some of you can relate personally to Jairus' despair, can't you? There's a Buddhist legend from centuries ago in which a woman in grief over her dead child went to Buddha to plead that the child might be returned to life. Buddha sent her on an unusual mission, promising to minister to her need when she returned. She was to go and collect a bowl of peppers from all the families who had not experienced grief such as hers. Mystified but desperate for help, she undertook the assignment. When evening came, the woman returned. Her bowl was still empty, but she was filled with understanding. No one is exempt. Everyone finds themselves in darkness sooner or later. And it's natural at such times to question whether the light will ever come again. Jairus was a desperate man. His daughter lay dying, and he had to do something. And what did he do? He turned to Jesus. He was truly a wise man. George Gallup once conducted a poll and found that more than half of the Americans who are experiencing grief turn to God, prayer, and Scripture for comfort. And of those who do, 94% say that it is highly effective. Where else do you turn in those hours when you're in darkness and it doesn't look like the light will ever come? Let me tell you about a man named Robert. Robert had everything. He was a successful developer. He was the CEO of a $32 million a year business in the Boston area. But suddenly the bottom fell out. His business collapsed in the early 2000s, and he was plunged into bankruptcy. I had a wonderful firm with 50 people, Robert says of his forward company. His company has helped disadvantaged people obtain affordable housing, but federal funds became scarce, and they went bankrupt. But not only did his company go bankrupt, his personal life went bankrupt too. In a 3-year period, at the same time he lost his business, Robert's father died. His father-in-law died. His wife became an alcoholic. And his eldest child was committed to a hospital for a year. One day as Robert was driving home, he was so distraught that he could hardly drive his car. As he later recalled that day, he said, "I got out of the car and got down on my knees and prayed for help." He had hit bottom and felt totally defeated. He says, "I prayed for help, not believing that anyone could help me. But when I got up, I knew something extraordinary had happened. For the first time there was clarity, a lightness, a sense of peace." Robert had not been to church for many years, but after that experience he began attending again. He began reading the Bible and found himself drawn to the Psalms. He found they had meaning for his life. When he went into the church for the first time, he read Psalm 30. "When I felt secure, I said, I will never be shaken. I realized," he says, "that I had suffered from the sin of overconfidence." His life changed from that moment on. He had learned not to put his trust in himself, but in God. When Jairus reached that same depth of despair, he turned to the only source of help he knew. He came to Jesus and led him to his house. The crowd that was with Jesus overheard their conversation and began to follow as well. But before they arrived at the house, some servants came with bad news. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" The night-black terror struck Jairus when he heard the news. But Jesus placed his hand gently on Jairus' shoulder and said, "Don't be afraid. Just believe." When they arrived at Jairus' house, they found people weeping and wailing uncontrollably over the death of the little girl. Jesus asked them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." With that statement, the mourners began to laugh at Jesus. They began to mock him. Clearly, they didn't believe him. But Jesus was unmoved by their laughter. He went off alone with the girl and spoke words of life. "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately, the girl got up and began to walk around. It was a miracle. The people who had laughed and mocked Jesus just a few minutes before were amazed when they saw the girl moving about. They had never seen anything like this. The dead simply do not come back to life. Then Jesus told them to give the girl something to eat, signifying that everything was all right. Jesus gave Jairus and his family the gift of life restored. I wonder what kind of effect this miracle had on Jairus. There's a man named John Ulrich, who was a new person thanks to such a miracle. In 1996, Ulrich's son was taken to the hospital with no heartbeat and no brain waves. Co-workers had found him at a work site. No one knew what had happened. The doctors managed to restore the man's vital signs, but for 3 days he remained in a coma. On the 4th day, he awoke, but he was completely insane. His father was beside himself, he says. "I walked out of that room, and I saw a sign for the chapel. I thought I might as well try that." There in the hospital chapel, he prayed. The next day, he asked his wife to pray with him. That evening, John Ulrich prayed all night. "My shirt was soaking with sweat," he remembers. Ulrich promised God that he would give up his bad habits and even his good job if only God would give his son back to him. The next day, he returned to his son's hospital room. His son was sitting up in bed, calmly talking to his mother. Ulrich sat down and talked to his son for 2 hours. He was perfect, Ulrich says. Ulrich followed through with his promise. He broke his habits of smoking and drinking. He even quit his well-paying job, which required him to be away from his family. Before too long, John Ulrich began lay preaching at various churches, and he took some seminary courses. To this day, Ulrich has been to El Salvador 7 times. He's also gone on a missionary trip to Mexico and Cameroon. John Ulrich discovered what millions of people have discovered through the centuries. When things seem hopeless, turn to Jesus. Now, I sum this all up in a rather frivolous way, but a way in which some of us may remember what I said this morning. Whether you're a basketball fan or not, you probably are familiar with the name Larry Bird, the former basketball great of the Boston Celtics. During a retirement party for Larry Bird in Boston Garden, former Celtics coach Casey Jones told of diagramming a play on the sidelines, only to have Bird dismiss it, saying, "Get the ball to me and get everyone out of my way." Jones responded, "I'm the coach, and I will call the plays." And Jones turned to the other players and said, "Get the ball to Larry and get out of his way." That's basically the message for today. When those times of terror come, when it seems that the light will never come and you have nowhere else to turn, give the ball to Jesus and get out of the way. You will discover, as did Jairus, that Christ will not let you down. Will you please pray with me? Gracious God, in those moments of darkness, we confess we don't always come with confidence to our time of prayer. Our petitions lack audacity, and fear and doubt create holes in the fabric of our certainty and hope. Give us a glimpse of the possible, and still our minds to make room for you, O God. Open our hearts so that we might hear your voice say, "Do not fear, only believe." Amen.